She was 14 years old, standing at a fence line in Montana, watching 4 engineers set up a folding table on the bank of the Cottonwood River. They had expensive equipment, licensed surveyors, and a geotechnical firm out of Billings. She had a green spiral notebook and 53 years of her grandfather's handwriting. She told them, as
Grandpa's
clearly
notes
as
on
a
the herd are so
14-year-old can
detailed.
tell a
He was
room
always
full of
thorough. Here's
professionals
your coffee.
anything, that they were
Thanks,
about to
Dad.
build a $21
We'll
million
get through this.
facility on
I
top
know.
of a buried river channel that had been moving water under that ground since before anyone in Denver had ever heard of this valley. They thanked her politely. One of the younger men laughed, just a little. 2 years later, a bank vice president flew in from Denver, shook her hand, and asked if she would please walk him through everything she knew. The valley remembers things people forget. That was what her grandfather used to say, standing on the porch in the blue hour before sunrise, watching the mist crawl out of the low places like something slow and breathing. He said the land kept records. That if you watched long enough, you'd learn to read them. Maren Holloway had been reading them her whole life. The Holloway farm sat on the eastern bend of the Cottonwood River in a stretch of Montana that most people drove through without stopping. 300 acres of hayfield and pasture and the kind of timber that had been there before anyone arrived with a deed. The house was built in 1911. The barn leaned a little to the south, and her father said it had been leaning that way since before he was born. Some things settle into their tilt and stay there. That spring the river ran lower than it should have. Not dramatically, 3 or 4 inches off the high water mark on the Cottonwood by the ford. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Maren noticed. She noticed the killdeer were nesting 20 yards farther from the bank than the year before. She noticed the cattails on the south slough had thinned out. She noticed that the wet patch at the base of the lower pasture, the one that had been wet every May for as long as she could remember, was dry on top and soft underneath. You could push a stick through the surface and feel nothing for the first 6 inches, then meet something cold and yielding below. She wrote it all down in a green spiral notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. Dates, water levels, where the deer were drinking, which gates the cattle wouldn't walk through, which ones they crowded toward in the afternoon. Her grandfather had kept the same kind of notebook for 53 years. They were stacked in a wooden crate in the loft, every one of them in his small, neat hand. She had read every single one. She wasn't a strange child. She just listened more than she talked. The trucks came in late April. 3 white pickups with a logo on the doors, a stylized shield, the words Continental Trust Bank, Commercial Real Estate Division. Behind the trucks came a low loader carrying a surveyor's rig, and behind that a black SUV that didn't look like it belonged on a gravel road. They stopped at the fence line where the Holloway property ended and the old Pute place began. 5,000 acres. The Putes had sold the previous fall, after the last brother passed and the heirs decided none of them wanted to come back to Montana. Continental Trust had bought the parcel outright through its commercial division. A long-term hold, the feed store said. Plans to develop and lease. The land had sat quiet through the winter. Now it wasn't quiet anymore. Maren watched from the kitchen window while she rinsed her cereal bowl. Her father came in behind her, pulling on his canvas jacket. He was 46 and looked older. He'd been running the place alone since her grandfather's stroke 2 summers back. They started early, he said. What are they building? Some kind of logistics hub. Distribution, agricultural processing, on the Pute land. He poured his coffee. On all of it. She set the bowl in the rack. All 5,000 acres? That's what the man at the feed store said. Bank flew its people in from Denver. She dried her hands on the towel and looked back out at the 3 men standing near the corner post. One of them was holding a tablet, gesturing at the slope that ran down toward the river bottom. The slope where the ground went soft in May. Dad. She kept her voice level. That's a bad place to build. He looked at her for a long second. He knew what she meant. He had grown up on this land too. But he was tired, and there were $800 of vet bills on the kitchen table, and the land on the other side of that fence was not his land. It's not our land, Maren. The bank can do what it wants with it. She nodded. She understood that. But she went and got her notebook anyway. The first time she actually spoke to them was a Tuesday. She was walking the fence line the way she did every week, checking for breaks in the wire, watching the ground. The 3 men had become 4 men and a woman, and they were standing around a folding table set up on the far side of the fence with a roll of plans weighted down by river stones. The woman saw her first. Maybe 40 years old, blonde hair pulled back, expensive boots that hadn't been broken in yet. "Hey there, you live around here?" Marin pointed across the fence. "Right there." "Oh, perfect. We're going to be neighbors, sort of." The smile was genuine, not unkind. "I'm Lauren Castile. I'm with Continental Trust, the bank that owns this parcel now. We're project managing the development." Marin looked at the plans on the table. She couldn't read them upside down, but she could see the general layout. A long rectangular building marked Phase 1 down near the river bottom, with parking and a holding yard above it, and 2 more phases stretching up the slope toward the timber. "You're putting the main building down there?" Lauren glanced at the plans. "The processing facility, yeah. We need rail access. The spur line runs along the bottom." She looked up, still friendly. "Why?" Marin chose her words carefully. Her grandfather had taught her that you only got one chance to be heard by people who weren't listening, and you shouldn't waste it on the wrong sentence. "The river doesn't stay where you think it does." Lauren tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "It moved twice in my grandfather's lifetime. There's an old channel under that bottom. You can see it in the spring. The grass comes in different, the ground stays soft a long way down. It runs from the high pasture all the way down toward our spring." One of the men, older, a fleece vest with the bank's shield on the chest, looked up from his tablet. "We've got a geotechnical survey scheduled for next week. Drilling test pits across the whole footprint. Appreciate the heads up, though." He said it kindly. That was the part that stung the most. He wasn't dismissing her out of meanness. He was being polite to a child. "The pits won't be in the right places," Marin said. "The channel curves. It doesn't run straight." The man smiled. "We use a licensed firm out of Billings. They know what they're doing. Bank wouldn't sign off otherwise." She nodded. There wasn't anything else to say. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and walked back along the fence. Behind her, she heard Lauren say something quiet to one of the younger men, and he laughed. Just a small laugh, the kind people make when something is harmless. That night, she opened her grandfather's 1987 notebook and read the entry for May 14th of that year. Bottom field flooded again. 3rd time in 11 years. Old channel running. Cattle wouldn't drink at the South Trough. She wrote her own entry directly beneath it. The drilling rig came on a Thursday. It set up on the high ground first, 3 test pits along the upper slope where the timber thinned out. The samples came up dry and firm. The geotechnical engineer, a man named Patel, walked his rig down the slope in stages, pulling cores every 200 feet on the grid the bank's architects had given him. When they got to the bottom, the samples looked normal at every drill point. Brown silt, some clay, a few river stones. Patel marked them, bagged them, photographed them. He drilled to 12 feet at each point, the depth specified in the contract, and at each point he hit firm ground at 11. What the grid didn't account for was the curve. Marin watched from her side of the fence and understood exactly what was happening. The buried channel curved through the bottom land in a long, lazy S-shape, and Patel's grid points were falling on either side of it without ever crossing it directly. Her grandfather had walked her along that curve the summer she was 9, pointing out where the grass changed color in the dry years. Patel was missing the channel laterally, 20 feet here, 30 feet there. To him, the bottom looked solid. The grid said so. She didn't say anything. She had already said her piece. They broke ground in June. The graders came first, peeling the topsoil off the building footprint and pushing it into long berms along the eastern edge. Then the excavators, digging down for the foundation pad. They had to go 8 feet deep for the slab and the loading dock pits. At 6 feet on the river side, they hit water. Not a flood, a seep. A wet darkening in the wall of the cut. Patel came back out. He looked at it, took readings, and told the foreman it was within tolerance. There was groundwater in any river bottom. They would lay a drainage course and a vapor barrier and proceed. The foreman, who had built things in a lot of places, agreed. The bank's project office in Denver signed off on the variance that same afternoon. They poured the footings on a Wednesday in late June. The slab went down the following Tuesday. Marin wrote it all down. She didn't know what else to do. The first hairline crack appeared in late August, 8 weeks after the pour. It ran across the northeast corner of the slab, the kind of thing a finishing crew would have noted and called with intolerance. By mid-October it had widened to a 1/4 inch and grown 2 companions, all of them running the same direction, all of them on the river side of the building. The steel went up that month, and the load on the slab increased. Engineers came back. They argued about it. One blamed the concrete mix. Another blamed the curing. A third, a younger woman with a master's degree from the Colorado School of Mines, walked the perimeter for 2 hours, then asked the foreman a single question: had anyone drilled deeper than 12 feet anywhere on the bottom or off the grid? Nobody had. She went back to her car and made phone calls. In November, Marin noticed the cattle had stopped drinking from the south trough. This was the trough fed by the spring at the base of the slope on the hollow side of the fence, the spring her family had used her entire life. It sat lower than the construction site. The bottomlands sloped gently south-southwest, and the spring emerged at the toe of that slope on Holloway land, directly downgradient of the bank's building footprint. Her father tasted the water that morning and spat it out. There was a metallic edge to it, faint, but unmistakable. He called the county extension office. They came out and took a sample. 2 weeks later, the report arrived. Elevated turbidity. Trace petroleum compounds. Suspended sediment consistent with disturbance of an upstream aquifer. Her father read the report twice, then went out and stood on the porch for a long time. When he came back in, he said, "Get your notebook?" The meeting was held at the county extension office on a Thursday in early December. Marin wore a blue flannel shirt and her good boots. Her notebook was on her lap. Lauren Castile was there. So was the older man in the fleece vest, whose name turned out to be Derek Holm, Vice President, Commercial Real Estate. Patel was there. So was the young engineer from the Colorado School of Mines, whose name was Ms. Aguilar. A man from the Department of Environmental Quality. The county commissioner. A lawyer for Continental Trust who didn't say much. Ms. Aguilar spoke first. She had conducted her own independent analysis. She had reviewed historical aerial photographs going back to 1954. She had pulled the original soil survey from the 1970s. And she had identified, entirely on her own initiative, a buried paleochannel running diagonally beneath the building site, curving through the footprint in a long S-shape oriented in places 40 degrees off the test grid. The channel was filled with permeable alluvium to a depth of 44 feet. Patel's 12-foot test pits had landed on either shoulder of the channel, missing its center laterally. The building's foundation had been placed directly across the deepest part. The slab cracks were the result of differential settlement. The contamination of the Holloway spring, which sat downgradient of the site, was the result of construction runoff entering the buried channel at the excavation cut and being transmitted downhill through the gravel to the spring's outlet on the Holloway property. She had a map. She put it on the table. Marin looked at it. The channel, drawn in red, ran exactly where her grandfather had walked her when she was 9 years old. The room was silent for a moment. Derek Holm cleared his throat. "I'd like to ask," he said carefully, "whether anyone at any point mentioned the existence of this channel before construction began." Patel looked at his hands. Lauren Castile looked at Marin. Marin didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her father said it quietly, without any particular edge in his voice. "My daughter told you in April." Things moved quickly after that. The Department of Environmental Quality issued a notice. Continental Trust had to halt construction and commission a full hydrogeological study. The cost estimate, when it arrived, was just over $4 million, on top of the $17 million the bank had already sunk into the project. The slab would have to be removed. The building would have to be redesigned, relocated, or both. The Holloway spring would be remediated at the bank's expense, and the family would receive a settlement for the loss of use. But that wasn't the part that mattered. The part that mattered was the second meeting, held in January at the same extension office. Ms. Aguilar was there. Derek Holm was there. So was a man named Vance, who had flown in from the bank's regional headquarters in Denver and who introduced himself to Marin by name and shook her hand. He had brought a roll of new plans. He laid them on the table and asked if she would walk him through what she knew about the bottom land. Not the channel, they had the channel now. The other things. The frost pockets. The drainage patterns. The places her grandfather had marked over 53 years of careful observation. She looked at her father. He nodded. She opened her notebook. She talked for an hour and 10 minutes. They took notes. Ms. Aguilar asked questions and Marin answered them in the short, direct sentences her grandfather had taught her. When she pointed at a spot on the new plans where they were proposing to put a retention pond and explained why the ground there wouldn't hold water in August, Vance wrote it down without arguing. When the meeting ended, Derek Holmes stayed behind. He stood for a moment looking at the green spiral notebook in her hands. "How long have you been keeping that?" "Since I was 8. And before that, my grandfather. He started in 1971. He nodded slowly. He looked tired in a way he hadn't looked in April, the specific tiredness of someone who has come to understand an expensive mistake that didn't have to happen. "We should have listened to you," he said. "In the spring when you came to the fence." Marin thought about it for a moment. Then she gave him the small, even nod her grandfather used to give when there was nothing more that needed to be said. He held out his hand. She shook it. By the following spring, the new plans had been finalized. The processing facility was rebuilt on the upper bench, 300 yards east of the original site, on firm ground that drained naturally to the north. The bottom land was left alone. The bank signed it into a conservation easement, partly as a goodwill gesture, and partly because the engineers had finally understood, in the most expensive way available, that you could not build there for any amount of money the bank could lend itself. The buried channel ran where it had always run. The killdeer came back to nest in their old places along the bank. Marin turned 15 in May. In June, she came home from school and found a thick envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was a copy of the new site plan, professionally bound, with a note from Ms. Aguilar paper-clipped to the cover. "We named the watershed feature after your grandfather. The Holloway Palea Channel. It'll be in the county records now." Her father read the note over her shoulder. He didn't say anything. After a while he went outside and stood on the porch in the blue hour, watching the mist crawl out of the low places the way the mist always had. She joined him there. The way she always had. The river ran where it ran. The land kept its records. And somewhere in a bank office in Denver, on a wall behind a vice president's desk, there was a hand-drawn map of a Montana valley, and a 14-year-old girl's name was written in the corner where everyone who walked into the room could see it. Some knowledge never makes it into reports. But sometimes, if you write it down carefully enough and wait long enough and refuse to stop saying what you know to be true, it finds its way in anyway. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find their way here. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are many more quiet people who paid attention when no one else did, and who turned out to be right in ways that mattered. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these valleys travel. I'll see you in the next one.